we're back again for story time. Tonight I'm going to read The Emperor's New Clothes, and also I'm going to read the Rose Elf as the You okay?
Just sneezed.
Okay. As they're incredibly short. How do I fix my position, hun? Come sit up.
Open up easy fence. Unhide.
There we go. Sorry, am I still getting used to things. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. So we have The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen. Many, many years ago lived an emperor who thought so much of new clothes that he spent all his money in order to obtain them. His only ambition was to be always well dressed. He did not care for his soldiers, and the theater did not amuse him. The only thing, in fact, he thought anything of was to drive out and show a new suit of clothes. He had a coat for every hour of the day, and as one would say of a king, he is in his cabinet, so one could say of him, the emperor is in his dressing room. The great city where he resided was very gay. Every day, many strangers from all parts of the globe arrived. One day, 2 swindlers came to this city. They made people believe that they were weavers and declared they could manufacture the finest cloth to be imagined. Their colors and patterns, they said, were not only exceptionally beautiful, but the clothes made of their materials possessed the wonderful quality of being invisible to any man who was unfit for his office or unpardoningly stupid. That must be wonderful cloth, thought the emperor. If I were to be dressed in a suit made of this cloth, I would be able to find out which men in my empire were unfit for their places, and I could distinguish the clever from the stupid. I must have this cloth woven for me without delay. And he gave a large sum of money to the swindlers in advance, that they should set to work without any loss of time. They set up 2 looms and pretended to be very hard at work, but they did nothing whatever on the looms. They asked for the finest silk and the most precious gold cloth. All they got, they did away with, and worked at the empty looms till late at night. I should very much like to know how they are getting on with the cloth, thought the emperor, but he felt rather uneasy when he remembered that he who was not fit for his office could not see it. Personally, he was of the opinion that he had nothing to fear, yet he thought it advisable to send somebody else that first to see how matters stood. Everybody in town knew what a remarkable quality the stuff possessed, and all were anxious to see how bad or stupid their neighbors were. I shall send my honest old minister to the weavers, thought the emperor. He can judge best how the stuff looks, for he is intelligent, and nobody understands his office better than he. The good old minister went into the room where the swindlers sat before the empty looms. Heaven preserve us, he thought, and opened his eyes wide. I cannot see anything at all. But he did not say so. Both swindlers requested him to come near and asked him if he did not admire the exquisite pattern and the beautiful colors, pointing to the empty looms. The poor old minister tried his very best, but he could see nothing, for there was nothing to be seen. Oh dear, he thought, can I be so stupid? I should never have thought so, and nobody must know it. Is it possible that I am not fit for my office? No, no, I cannot say that I was unable to see the cloth. Oh, it is very pretty, exceedingly beautiful, replied the old minister, looking through his glasses. What a beautiful pattern! What brilliant colors! I shall tell the emperor that I like the cloth very much. We are pleased to hear that, said the two weavers, and described to him the colors and explained the curious pattern. The old minister listened attentively, that he might relate to the emperor what they said. And so he did. Now the swindlers asked for more money, silk and gold cloth, which they require for weaving. They kept everything for themselves, and not a thread came near the loom. But they continued, as hitherto, to work at the empty looms. Soon afterward, the emperor sent another honest courtier to the weavers to see how they were getting on, and if the cloth was nearly finished. Like the old minister, he looked and looked, but could see nothing, as there was nothing to be seen. Is it not a beautiful piece of cloth? Asked the two swindlers, showing and explaining the magnificent pattern, which, however, did not exist. I am not stupid, said the man. It is therefore my good appointment for which I am not fit. It is very strange, but I must not let anyone know it. And he praised the cloth, for which he did not see, and expressed his joy at the beautiful colors and the fine pattern. It is very excellent, he said to the emperor. Everybody in the whole town talked about the precious cloth. At last the emperor wished to see it himself, while it was still on the loom. With a number of courtiers, including the two who had already been there, he went to the two clever swindlers, who now worked as hard as they could, but without using any thread. Is it not magnificent? Said the two old statesmen who had been there before. Your Majesty must admire the colors and the pattern. And then they pointed at the empty looms, for they imagined the others could see the cloth. What is this? Thought the emperor. I do not see anything at all. That is terrible. Am I stupid? Am I unfit to be the emperor? That would indeed be the most dreadful thing that could happen to me. Really, he said, turning to the weavers, your cloth has our most gracious approval. And nodding contentedly, he looked at the empty loom, for he did not like to say that he saw nothing. All his attendants, who were with him, looked and looked, and although they could not see anything more than the others, they said, like the emperor, it is very beautiful, and all advised him to wear the new magnificent clothes at the great procession which was soon to take place. It is magnificent, beautiful, excellent, one heard them say. Everybody seemed to be delighted, and the emperor appointed the two swindlers imperial court weavers. The whole night previous to the day on which the procession was to take place, the swindlers pretended to work, but burned more than 16 candles. People should see that they were busy to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to take the cloth from the loom and worked about in the air with big scissors and sewed the needles without thread, and said at last, the emperor's new suit is ready now. The emperor and all his barons came to the hall. The swindlers held up their arms as if they held something in their hands and said, these are the trousers, this is the coat, and here is the cloak, and so on. They are all as light as cobweb, and one must feel as if one had nothing at all upon the body, but it is just the beauty of them. Indeed, said all the courtiers, but they could not see anything, for there was nothing to be seen. Does it please your Majesty now to graciously undress, said the swindlers, that we may assist your Majesty in putting on the new suit before the large looking-glass? The emperor undressed, and the swindlers pretended to put the new suit upon him, one piece after another, and the emperor looked at himself in the glass from every side. How well they look! How well they fit! Said all. What a beautiful pattern! What fine colors! That is a magnificent suit of clothes. The master of the ceremonies announced that the bearers of the canopy which was to be carried in the procession, was ready. "I am ready," said the emperor. "Does not my suit fit me marvelously?" Then he turned once more to the looking-glass, that people should think he admired his garments. The chamberlains, who were to carry the train, stretched their hands to the ground as if they lifted up a train, and pretended to hold something in their hands. They did not like people to know they could not see anything. The emperor marched in the procession under the beautiful canopy, and all who saw him in the street and out in the windows exclaimed, "Indeed, the emperor's new clothes are incomparable. What a long train he has! How well it fits him!" Nobody wished to let the others know that he saw nothing, for then he would have been unfit for his office, or too stupid. Never an emperor's clothes were more admired. "But he has nothing on at all," said a little child at last. "Good heavens, listen to the voice of an innocent child," said the father, and one whispered to the other what the child had said. "But he has nothing on at all," cried at last the whole people. That made a deep impression upon the emperor, for it seemed to him that they were right, and he thought to himself, "Now I must bear up to the end." And the chamberlains walked with still greater dignity as they carried the train, which did not exist. Hello, General Setsubun.
It's Maki.
Yes, I know it is Maki, sweetie. What do you think of the story? Hey, Caliber, how's it going? So yeah, that is The Emperor's New Clothes, about a pair of criminals who pretend to make clothing for an emperor and absolutely waste his time and don't make anything at all. Alright, and since that one was so short, we're going to go to The Rose Elf, which happens to be the very next story. It is also another short one. I have never read this one before, so I don't know what it's about. He had on his undergarments, but the outer garments were missing. Okay, so for the Rose Elf. Hush you. Alright. In the midst of a garden grew a rose tree. Upon it were many, many roses. In one of them, the most beautiful of all, lived an elf. He was so very small that no human eye could perceive him. Behind every petal of the rose he had a bedroom. No child could have been more beautifully formed than he was. He had wings that reached from his shoulders down to his feet. All his rooms were so sweet and fragrant, the walls were so bright and beautiful, for they consisted of the pink rose petals. All day long the elf enjoyed himself in the warm sunshine, flying from flower to flower and dancing on the wings of the fluttering butterfly. One day he measured how many steps he would have to take in order to pass through all the roads and paths which were on a single leaf of the lime tree. These were what we call the veins of the leaf. To him, they seemed to be endless roads. Before he had finished, the sun had set. He had begun his task too late. It became very cold, dew fell, and the wind was blowing. At this time, he would have been best at home. He hastened as much as he could, but his rose was closed up. He could not enter, and not a single rose was open. The poor little elf was very frightened. He had never before been out of doors at night, as he had always sweetly slumbered behind the warm rose petals. This would mean certain death to him. The elf knew that any other end of the garden stood a summer house, covered all over with beautiful honeysuckle. The blossoms looked like large painted horns. In one of them, he thought, he might enter asleep until the next morning. Thither he flew. But hush, two people were sitting in the summer house, a handsome young man and a beautiful girl. They sat side by side and wished that they need never part. They loved one another so much, much more indeed than the best child could love his father or mother. Alas, we must part, said the young man. Your brother dislikes me, and that is why he sends me on an errand so far away over mountains and seas. Farewell, my own dear love, for that you will always be to me. Then they kissed each other, and the girl cried and gave him a rose. But before she gave it to him, she so ardently pressed it to her lips that the flower opened. Now the little elf flew into it and rested his head against the fine, fragrant walls. There he could hear very well how they bade farewell to each other. He felt that the young man placed the rose on his breast. Oh, how his heart was beating! The little elf could not fall asleep. It throbbed so much. The rose did not long remain undisturbed on his breast. The young man, while walking alone through the dark forest, took it out and kissed it so often and so passionately that the little elf was almost crushed. He could feel through the leaf just how hot the young man's lips were, and the rose had opened its petals as if the strongest midday sun were shining upon it. Then came another man, sullen and wicked. He was the malicious brother of the beautiful girl. He drew out a dagger, and while the other fondly kissed the rose, stabbed him to death. Then he cut off the head of the body, and buried both in the soft ground under a lime tree. Now he's gone and forgotten, thought the murderer. He will never return again. He was to set out on a long journey over mountains and across the sea. On such an expedition, a man might easily lose his life, and he has lost it. He will never come back, and my sister dare not ask me what has become of him. Thus thinking, he scraped dry leaves together with his foot, heaped them on the soft mold, and went home in the darkness of the night. But he was not alone, as he imagined, for the little elf was with him. He had seated himself in a dry, rolled-up leaf of the lime tree, which had fallen on the wicked man's hair while he was digging the grave. He had put his hat on now. It was very dark inside the hat, and the elf was trembling with horror and indignation at the evil deed. In the dawn of the morning, the murderer reached home. He took off his hat and entered his sister's bedroom. There the beautiful girl, with rosy cheeks, was sleeping and dreaming of him who she loved so dearly, and whom she supposed now traveled over the mountains and across the sea. The unnatural brother bent over the girl and laughed hideously, as only evil demons can laugh. The dry leaf dropped out of his hair and onto her counterpane, but he did not notice it, and went out of the room to have a little sleep in the early morning hours. The little elf left his resting place and slipped into the ear of the sleeping girl and told her, as in a dream, the horrible deed. He described the spot where her lover was stabbed and where his body was interred. He told her of the blooming lime tree standing close by and said, "That you should not think all I told you is only a dream. You will find on your bed, on waking, a dry leaf." And when she awoke, she really found it. Then she cried bitterly. The window was open all day long. The little elf might easily have returned to the roses and to the other flowers in the garden, but he had not the heart to leave the unfortunate girl. "Hey, Mr. Brawl." On the windowsill stood a little bunch of monthly roses in a flower pot. In one of its blooms, the elf sat down and looked at the poor girl. Her brother came several times into the room, and in spite of his crime, seemed quite cheerful, and she had not the courage to say a word about her grief. No sooner had the night come, and she stole out of the house and went into the wood, to the spot where the lime tree stood. She removed the dry leaves from the ground, turned the earth up, and found her murdered sweetheart. She wept bitterly, She prayed God that she might also die. She would have gladly taken the body home with her, but that was impossible. So she took up the pale-faced head with the closed eyes, kissed the gold lips, and shook the earth out of the beautiful curls. "I will at least keep this," she said, and when she had replaced the mold and the dry leaves on the body, she took the head and a little bough of a jasmine bush growing near the spot where the body was buried, and returned home. Upon reaching her room, she took the largest flower pot she could find and put the head into it, covered it over with mold, and planted therein the jasmine bough. "Farewell, farewell," whispered the little elf, being unable to witness any longer her grief and pain. He then returned to his rose in the garden, but the rose was faded, and only a few withered petals were still clinging to the green stalk. "Oh, how soon all that is beautiful and good vanishes," sighed the little elf. At last he found a new rose and made it his home. Under the shelter of its tender and fragrant petals, he could abide its safety. Every morning he flew to the window of the poor girl, and every morning he found her crying by the flower pot. Her tears fell upon the jasmine bough, and day by day, in the same measure as she grew paler, the bough became fresher and greener. One shoot after another sprang up. Many little white buds burst forth, and she kissed them. What was that? Oh! Thank you, Shadowfang. The heartless brother scolded her and asked her if she had lost her senses, for he did not like seeing her crying over the flower pot, and he could not make out why she did it. He had no idea whose closed eyes, whose red lips, were decaying in the flower pot. One day the little rose elf found her slumbering and resting with her head on the flower pot. He slipped again into her ear and told her of the evening in the summer house, of the sweet smell of the rose, and of the love of rose elves. She dreamed so sweetly, and with her dream her life passed away. She died a calm and peaceful death. She had gone to heaven to him whom she loved. Alright, welcome to the chat. And the jasmine unfolded its buds into large white flowers, and filled the air with its peculiarly sweet fragrance. It could not otherwise give vent into its grief for the dead girl. Hey, Lemmy. Hello, Malcurious. The wicked brother took the beautiful jasmine bush as his inheritance, carried it into his bedroom, and placed it close by his bed. For it was delightful to look at, and its fragrance was very pleasant. The little rose elf followed. He flew from flower to flower, for in each of them lived a little elf, and told them of the murdered young man whose head was decaying beneath the mold, and of the wicked brother and the poor sister. "We all know about it," replied the little elves. "We know it, for we have not sprung forth from the eyes and lips of the dead man's face. We know," they repeated, nodding their heads in a strange manner. The rose elf could not understand why they remained so calm. He flew out to the bees, which were gathering honey, and told them the story of the wicked brother. The bees told their queen, and the queen ordered that they should all go the next morning to kill the murderer. But when it was night, the first night after the sister's death, while the brother was sleeping close by the fragrant jasmine bush in his bed, all its flowers opened, and all the little invisible elves came out, armed with a venomous spear, and seated themselves in his ears and told him terrible dreams. Then they flew onto his lips and stabbed his tongue with their poisonous weapons. Now we have avenged the dead, they said, and returned to their white flowers. When on the next morning the window of the bedroom was opened, the rose elf and the whole swarm of the bees with their queen entered to carry out their revenge. But he was already dead. People standing around the bed said, "The smell of jasmine has killed him." The rose elf understood the revenge of the flowers and told the queen of the bees about it, who, with her whole swarm, was humming around the flower pot. The bees could not be driven away from it, and when at last a man took up the pot, a bee stung him in the hand, so he dropped it, and it broke into pieces. And all saw the bleached skull and understood that the dead man in the bed was the murderer. The queen of the bees hummed and sang of the revenge of the flowers and of the rose elf, and said that behind the smallest leaf dwells one who can disclose evil deeds and revenge them. And that is the the rose elf. Again, I've never read that one, and wow. So we went from the Emperor's New Clothes to that. I actually have the entire Hans Christian Andersen classic fairy tales if anybody wants me to keep reading. Because it's only been about 30 minutes. Okay, so let's see. Let's go to one that probably a lot of people will know of because Disney. Actually, I don't. Actually, I don't think it is Disney. Let's see. Okay. Alright, so how does everybody feel about Thumbelina? Okay. Thank you, bro. Alright, so Thumbelina then. Once upon a time, there was a woman who wished very much to have a very small child, but she did not know where to get one. So she went to an old witch and said to her, "I would so very much like to have a small child. Can you tell me where I can get one?" "Oh, we will soon be able to manage that," said the witch. "Here is a barley corn, and it is not of the same kind that grows in the farmer's field, or that the chickens get to eat. Put it in a flower pot, and you will see something." "Thank you," said the woman, and gave the witch 12 shillings, for that was the price of it. Then she went home and planted the barley corn. Immediately there grew up a large, handsome flower, looking like a tulip. The leaves, however, were tightly closed, as though it were still a bud. "It is a beautiful flower," said the woman, kissing its red and yellow leaves. But as she kissed it, the flower opened with a bang. It was a real tulip, as could now be seen, but in the middle of the flower, on the green velvety pistils, sat a tiny maiden, delicately and gracefully formed. She was scarcely half a thumb's length high, and therefore she was called Thumbelina. A neat polished walnut shell served Thumbelina for a cradle. Blue violet leaves were her mattresses, and a rose leaf her blanket, where she slept at night. But in the daytime she played about on the table, where the woman put a plate with a wreath of flowers around it, the stalks of which stood in water. On this water floated a large tulip leaf, and on this she could sit a row from one side of the plate to the other, having 2 white horsehairs for oars. It looked wonderfully pretty. She could sing too, and indeed so tenderly and prettily as had never been heard before. One night, as she was laying in her pretty bed, an old toad came creeping in through the window, in which there was a broken pane. The toad was a very ugly one, large and wet. It hopped down upon the table where Thumbelina lay sleeping under the red rose leaf. "She would be a pretty wife for my son," said the toad, taking the walnut shell in which Thumbelina was sleeping, and hopping with it through the window down into the garden. There flowed a great wide brook, the margin of which was swampy and marshy, and here lived the toad with her son. Ugh, he was so ugly and nasty, and looked just like his mother. Okay. "Croak, croak," was all that he could say when he spied the graceful little girl in the walnut shell. "Don't speak so loud, else you'll wake her," said the old toad. "She might run away from us, for she is as light as a swan's down. So we will put her on one of the broad leaves of the water lily in the brook. That will be just like an island for her. She is so light and small, she will not be able to run away from there while we are getting ready the stateroom under the marsh, where you two will live and keep house." Out in the brook there grew a great many water lilies and broad green leaves, which looked as though they were floating on the water. The leaf which lay farthest off was the largest. To this the old toad swam out and laid the walnut shell with Thumbelina upon it. Tiny Thumbelina woke early in the morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to cry very bitterly, for there was water on every side of the great green leaf, and she could not get to land. The old toad was sitting in the marsh, decking out her room with reeds and yellow flowers. It was to be made very pretty for the new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf where Thumbelina was. They wanted to fetch her a pretty bed, which was to be placed in the bridal chamber before she herself entered it. The old toad bowed down in the water before her and said, "Here you have my son. He will be your husband, and you will live in the great splendor down in the marsh." "Croak, croak," was all the son could say. Then they took the pretty little bed and swam away with it, leaving Thumbelina sitting alone on the little bed, and swam away with it. They took the little bed and swam away with it, leaving Thumbelina sitting alone on the green leaf, crying, for she did not want to live with the nasty old toad, or have her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes swimming down in the water had both seen the toad and also heard what she said. Soon they put out their heads, for they wanted to see the pretty little girl too. As soon as she saw her, they thought her so pretty that they felt very sorry that she was to go down to the ugly toad. No, that should never be. They assembled together down in the water round the green stalk that held the leaf on which the maiden stood, and with their teeth they gnawed away at the stalk. The leaf floated away down the stream with Thumbelina, far away where the toad could not reach her. Thumbelina sailed by many towns, and the little birds sitting in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a lovely little girl!" The leaf went floating away with her farther and farther, so Thumbelina traveled right out of the country. A pretty little white butterfly kept flitting around her, and at last sat down upon the leaf. Thumbelina pleased him, and she was very glad for it, for the toad could not reach her, and it was so beautiful where she was. The sun was shining on the water, making it sparkle like the brightest silver. She took her girdle and tied one end of it round the butterfly, fastening the other end of the ribbon to the leaf, and glided along much quicker now, and she too, for of course she was standing on it. A great cockchafer came flying along, who spied her and immediately clasped his claws around her slender waist and flew up with her into a tree. The green leaf floated down the stream, and the butterfly with it, for he was bound fast to the leaf and could not get away. Heavens, how frightened poor Thumbelina was when the cockchafer flew up into the tree with her, but she was mostly grieved for the sake of the beautiful white butterfly, for which she had bound fast. In case he could not free himself, he would be obliged to starve. But the cockchafer did not care about that. He sat down with her on the largest green leaf of the tree, gave her the honey from the flowers to eat, and told her that she was very pretty, although she was not at all like a cockchafer. Later on, all the other cockchafers who lived in the tree came to pay a visit. They looked at Thumbelina and said, "She has not even more than 2 legs that look miserable." "She hasn't any feelers," said the other. "She has such a narrow waist and looks quite human. Ugh, how ugly she is." And all the lady cockchafers, or said all the lady cockchafers. And yet Thumbelina was very pretty. Even the cockchafer who had carried her off admitted that, but when all the others said she was ugly, he at last believed it too, and would no longer have her. She might go where she liked. So they flew off from the tree with her and put her upon a daisy. She wept because she was so ugly that the cockchafers would not have her, and yet she was the loveliest little girl that one could imagine, as delicate and as tender as one of the most beautiful rose leaf. The whole summer, though, poor Thumbelina lived alone in the great forest. She wove herself a bed out of blades of grass and hung it under a shamrock in order to be protected from the rain. She gathered the honey out of the flowers for food and drank of the dew that was on the leaves every morning. In this way, summer and autumn passed, but now came winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung so beautifully about her flew away. And the trees became bare and the flowers faded. The large shamrock under which she lived dried up, and there remains nothing of it but a withered stalk. She was dreadfully cold, for her clothes were in tatters, and she herself was so small and delicate. Poor little Thumbelina, she would be frozen to death. It began to snow, and every snowflake that fell upon her was like a whole shovelful thrown upon us, for we are so tall, and she was only an inch long. So she wrapped herself in a dry leaf, but that tore in half and would not warm her. She was shivering with cold. Close to the wood to which she had now come to lay a large cornfield, but the corn was gone long since, and only the dry, naked stubble stood out of the frozen ground. These were like a forest for her to wander through, and oh, how she trembled with cold. In this state she reached the door of a field mouse who occupied a hole under the corn stubbles. There the mouse lived comfortably, and had a whole room full of corn, a splendid kitchen of larder. Poor Thumbelina stood there before the door like a little beggar girl, and asked for a piece of barley corn, for she had not had bit to eat for 2 days. "You poor little creature," said the field mouse, for she was really a good old mouse. "Come into my warm room and dine with me." Now, being pleased with Thumbelina, she said, "If you like, you can stay with me the whole winter, but you must keep my room clean and neat, and tell me tales, for I am very fond of them." And Thumbelina did what the good old field mouse wished, and in return was treated uncommonly well. "Now we shall soon have a visit," said the field mouse. "My neighbor is in the habit of visiting me once a week. He is even better off than I am, has large rooms, and wears a beautiful black velvety fur. If you could only get him for a husband, you would be well provided for. But he cannot see. You must tell him the prettiest stories that you know." But Thumbelina did not trouble herself about it. She did not think much of the neighbor, for he was only a mole. He came and paid a visit with his black velvety fur. He was so rich and so learned, said the field mouse, that his dwelling was 20 times larger than hers. He possessed great learning, but he could not bear the sun and the beautiful flowers. Of the latter he seldom spoke, for he had never seen them. Thumbelina had to sing, and she sang, cockchafer, fly away," and "When the parson goes afield." So the mole fell in love with her because of her beautiful voice, but he said nothing, for he was a prudent man. A short time before, he had dug a passage through the earth for his house to theirs, and the field mouse and Thumbelina received permission to take a walk in this passage as often as they liked, but he begged them not to be afraid of the dead bird which lay there. It was an entire bird with feathers and beak, who had probably died only a short time before, and was buried just where the mole had made his passage. The mole took a piece of decayed wood in his mouth, for that glimmers like the light in the dark, and then went on in front, and lighted them through the long passage. When they came to the spot where the dead bird lay, the mole thrust his broad nose against the ceiling and pushed the earth up, so that a large hole was made, through which light could shine down. In the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, with its beautiful wings pressed close to its side, and its feet and head drawn under its feathers. The poor bird had certainly died of cold. This grieved Thumbelina very much. She was very fond of all the little birds who had sung and twittered so beautifully to her all summer. But the mole kicked him with his crooked legs and said, "He doesn't pipe up any more now. How miserable it must be born a little bird. Thank heaven that can happen to none of my children. Such a bird has nothing but his tweet, and is obligated to starve in winter." "Yes, you may say that as a sensible man," said the field mouse. "But what does the bird get for all his twittering when winter comes? He must starve and freeze. But I suppose that is considered very grand." Thumbelina said nothing, but when the two others had turned their backs upon the bird, she bent down, and putting the feathers aside which covered its head, she kissed him upon his closed eyes. "Perhaps it was he who sang so beautifully to me in the summer," she thought. "How much pleasure he has given me, the dear, beautiful bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which daylight shined in, and then accompanied the ladies home. But at night Thumbelina could get no sleep, so she got up from her bed and wove a fine large carpet of hay, which she carried along and spread over the dead bird. She also laid the tender stamina of flowers, which were soft as cotton, and which she had found in the field mouse's home, around the bird, so that he might lie warm. "Goodbye, you beautiful little bird," she said. "Goodbye, and many thanks for your beautiful singing in summer, when all the trees were green and the sun shined down warm upon us." Then she laid her head upon the bird's heart, but the bird was not dead. He was only lying there, benumbed, and having now been warmed again, was coming back to life. In autumn, all the swallows fly away to warm countries, but if there is one who is belated, it gets so frozen that it drops down as if dead, and remains lying where it falls, and soon the snow covers it. Thumbelina trembled, so frightened was she, for the bird was big, very big, compared with her, who was only an inch long. But she took courage, and lying the cotton more closely around the poor swallow, she fetched a leaf of mint, which she herself had used as a blanket, and laid it over the bird's head. The next night she again stole up to him. He was alive, but very weak, and could only open his eyes for a short moment to look at Thumbelina, who stood before him with a piece of decaying wood in her hand, for she had no other lantern. "Thank you, my pretty little child," said the sick swallow to her. "I have been so beautifully warm. Soon I shall get my strength back, and will then be able to fly about in the warm sunshine outside." "Oh," said she, "it is cold outside. It is snowing and freezing. Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." Then she brought the swallow some water and a leaf of a flower. This the swallow drank, and told her how he had torn one of his wings on a thorn bush, and had therefore been unable to fly so quickly as the other swallows, who had flown far away to warm countries. So he had at last fallen to the ground, but he could not remember anything more, and did not at all know how he had come to be there. So he remained down there the whole winter, and Thumbelina nursed and tended him with all her heart. Neither the mole nor the field mouse knew anything about it, for they did not like the poor swallow at all. As soon as spring came and the sun warmed the earth, the swallow said goodbye to Thumbelina, who opened the hole which the mole had made up above. The sun shined in beautifully upon them, and the swallow asked her whether she would go with him. She could sit upon his back, he said, and they would fly far into the green forest. But Thumbelina knew that it would grieve the old field mouse if she left her like that. "No, I cannot," she said. "Goodbye, goodbye, you pretty little girl," said the swallow, and flew out into the sunshine. Thumbelina looked after him, and the tears came into her eyes, for she was very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird, and flew into the green forest. Thumbelina was very sad. She got no permission to go into the warm sunshine. The corn, which had been sown into the field over the house of the field mouse, grew up high into the air. It was a thick wood for the poor girl who was only an inch high. "Now you are a bride, Thumbelina," said the field mouse. "Our neighbor has asked for your hand. What a great piece of luck for the poor child. Now you will have to make your outfit, both woolen and linen clothes, for you must lack nothing when you are a mole's wife." Thumbelina had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to weave for her day and night. Every evening the mole used to visit them, and was always saying that at the end of the summer the sun would not shine so warm by a long way, that it was burning the earth as hard as a stone. Yes, when the summer was over, he would celebrate his marriage with Thumbelina. But the latter was not at all pleased, for she could not bear the tiresome mole. Every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when it set, she stole out to the door, and when the wind parted the ears of corn, so that she could see the blue sky, she would think how bright and beautiful it was out there, and would have a great longing to see the dear swallow again. But he never came back. He had probably flown far away into the beautiful green wood. When autumn came, Thumbelina had her whole outfit ready. "You are to be married in 4 weeks," said the field mouse to her. But Thumbelina wept, and said that she would not have the tiresome mole. "Fiddlesticks," said the field mouse. "Don't be obstinate, or I will bite you with my white teeth. He is a fine man whom you are to marry. The queen herself has not such black velvety fur. He has a full kitchen and cellar. Be thankful for it." Now the wedding was to take place. The mole had already come to fetch Thumbelina. She was to live with him deep down under the earth, and never come out into the warm sunshine, for that he did not like. The poor little girl was very sad. She was now to say goodbye to the beautiful sun, which, while she lived with the field mouse, she had always had permission to look at from the door. "Goodbye, bright sun," she said, and stretched her arms out high, and walked a little way off from the house of the field mouse, for now the corn was cut, and there remained only the dry stubbles. "Goodbye, goodbye," she said. "Greet the little swallow for me if you see him." Tweet, tweet suddenly sounded above her head. She looked up and saw the little swallow, who was just flying by. When he spied Thumbelina, he was very pleased. She told him how unwilling she was to marry the ugly mole, and that she would have to live deep down under the earth, where the sun never shined. She could not help crying and telling it. "The cold winter is coming," said the little swallow. "I am flying away to warm countries. Will you come with me? You can sit on my back, then we shall fly away from the ugly mole and his dark room, far away over the mountains to the warm countries, where the sun shines more beautifully than here, where it is always summer, and there are glorious flowers. Do fly away with me, dear little Thumbelina, you who saved my life when I lay frozen in the dark underground cellar." "Yes, I will go with you," said Thumbelina, and she seated herself on the bird's back, with her feet on his outspread wing, binding her girdle fast to one of his strongest feathers. Then the swallow flew up into the air, over forest and sea, high up over the great mountains, where the snow always lies, and Thumbelina began to freeze in the cold air. But then she crept under the bird's warm feathers, and only put out her little head to admire all the beauty beneath her. At last they came to the warm countries, where the sun shined far brighter than here. The sky seemed twice as high, and in the ditches and on the hedges grew the finest green and blue grapes. In the woods hung citron and oranges. The air was heavy with the scent of myrtle and mint, and on the high roads the prettiest little children ran and played with large colored butterflies. But the swallow flew still farther, and it became more and more beautiful. Under the most majestic green trees by the blue lake stood a marble castle of dazzling whiteness, all of the old time. Vines wound themselves around the tall pillars, and up above there were a number of swallow nests, and in one of these lived the swallow who was carrying Thumbelina. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but it would not be proper for you to live here with me, and my arrangements are not such as you would be satisfied with. Pick out for yourself one of the most beautiful flowers that are growing down there, and I will put you onto it, and you shall have everything as nice as you can wish." "That is glorious," she said, clapping her little hands. There lay a large white marble pillar which had fallen to the ground and broken into 3 pieces. Between these grew the finest large white flowers. The swallow flew down and with Thumbelina and sat her upon the broad petals. But what was her surprise? In the middle of the flower sat a little man, as white and transparent as if he were made of glass. He wore the prettiest golden crown on his head, and had splendid little wings on his shoulders. He himself was no bigger than Thumbelina. He was the angel of the flower. In every flower lived such a little man or woman, but this one was king of it all. "Heavens, how beautiful he is," whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. The little prince was very frightened at the sight of the swallow, for it was a giant bird compared to him. He was so small and delicate. But when he spied Thumbelina, he was greatly pleased. She was the prettiest little girl he had ever seen. He therefore took his golden crown off his head and put it upon hers, asking her what her name was, and whether she would be his wife, when she should be queen of all the flowers. He was indeed quite a different man to the son of the toad and the mole with the black velvety fur. She said yes to the grand prince, and out of every flower came a lady and a gentleman, so dainty that they were all a pleasure to behold. Each one thought Thumbelina a present, or each one brought Thumbelina a present, but the best of all was a pair of beautiful wings from a large white fly. These were fastened onto Thumbelina's back, and now she too could fly flower to flower. there was much rejoicing, and in the little swallow sat up in his nest, and was to sing the bridal song, for he did as well as he could, although in his heart he was sad, for he was so fond of Thumbelina, and would have liked never to separate himself from her. You shall not be called Thumbelina, said the flower angel to her. That is an ugly name. You are too pretty for it. We will call you Maia. Goodbye, goodbye, said the little swallow with a heavy heart, and flew away from the warm countries back to Denmark, where he had a little nest over the window where the man lives who can tell tales. To him he sang tweet tweet, and that is how we know the story. And that is Thumbelina. And that will be it for the stories for tonight. What did everybody think? Thank you, Lumi. Yeah, I've done 3 stories. These are the short versions. They're the Hans Christian Andersen classic fairy tales. Oh. They are kind of interesting. After I'm done with this one, I'll ask which boat ones we should do. I do have some of the longer stories. I do actually have the longer version of the Little Mermaid. The last time I streamed, I read the shorter version. And then, of course, it's they're not all the happy ending like Disney is. Yeah. Disney and Pixar have happy endings. These ones, some do, some don't. And thank you, Shadowfang. So, I'm going to end my stream here, and, we canceled our stream for tomorrow because I picked up a shift at work, and, coffee, Thursday, what are we doing?
Thursday, I'm going to be doing Final Fantasy. Oops, you're breaking.
Oop, sorry. I turned to look at him, so my character borked a little bit. So Thursday, Coffee will be playing Final Fantasy 14, and Friday, Coffee and I will be playing Monster Hunter World with a few friends. I believe Kurofang and Staroni are going to be playing with us. Which I don't know if Staroni is actually in the chat or not. But yeah, so thank you everyone who joined us today, and I'll post up which stories I will be doing next time, and next week. And apparently Coffee just let me know that we actually have a YouTube channel now. It's what?
It's Cafe d'Arcadia.
It's called Cafe d'Arcadia, and he's was actively uploading our previous streams. So if you want to see how technologically incompetent I am, feel free to go check it out. Yeah. So thank you all who joined us, and see you guys next time.
Mhm.